Hello. In the early 1930s, as America sank into the Great Depression, millions were desperate and the future felt like a dead end. In that chaos, one name rose fast, bold, notorious, and impossible to ignore. He pulled off headline-grabbing bank robberies and, more than once, slipped away from the law like he'd been born to vanish. Within a year of his 1933 release, he became a national obsession, with some people calling him a modern Robin Hood, a gentleman thief, they said, stealing from the banks and sparing the little guy. But praise or hate, everyone agreed on one thing: he was dangerous, and he did not fear the law. To authorities, he wasn't just another robber. By 1934, he was being branded public enemy number one, not a slogan, a warning, the top target, the one they wanted off the streets at any cost. And the chase around him helped expand federal power, shaping the Bureau into the kind of nationwide force people now associate with the FBI. The man at the center of that storm was John Dillinger. Dillinger was born in 1903 in Indianapolis, Indiana, a busy Midwestern city with hard edges and hard rules. When he was just 3, his mother died, and the house never felt whole again. He was raised closely by family, especially his older sister, while grief rewired the home. When Dillinger was 9, his father remarried and started a second family. Dillinger moved back under his father's roof, but the new family order didn't sit well with him. His father, a grocer with a strict hand, believed discipline could fix anything, but Dillinger didn't want fixing. As a teen, he skipped school, chased baseball, and treated trouble like a hobby. He even pulled together a crew of about a dozen boys, known around the neighborhood for pulling stunts and picking fights. At 16, he quit school for good and took a job in a machine shop. Hoping country life would straighten him out, his father sold their city house and moved the family to a farm outside town, believing fields and chores would do what lectures couldn't. But farm life didn't change Dillinger, not even a little. He still traveled roughly 18 miles each day to work at the shop, and at night he drank hard and gambled harder. Around that time, he became fascinated with outlaw legends like Jesse James, and the romance of the outlaw life sank in deeper than anyone around him realized. In 1923, Dillinger got tangled with police after a car incident. He was arrested, and soon after that arrest in 1923, he left home and joined the U.S. Navy. He served aboard the battleship USS Utah, but discipline didn't suit him there either. In less than 6 months, he racked up punishments for repeated violations. When the ship docked in Boston, he saw an opening and ran. He deserted, became a wanted man in the military system, and never returned. He was eventually dishonorably discharged, stripping away any honor or future he could claim as a serviceman. Dillinger went back to his hometown and tried to live like a normal man. He married a 16-year-old girl, Beryl Hovius, and moved in with her family. For a moment, he seemed to settle. He played baseball locally, quick hands at shortstop, sharp reflexes, fast feet, but stability didn't last. He drifted back toward old company, long nights of drinking, talking big, dreaming bigger, and the talk always circled back to the same question: how do you get rich fast? For them, the answer wasn't work, it was crime. In September 1924, at 21, Dillinger committed his first serious robbery. He and an older friend, Ed Singleton, targeted a local grocery and overpowered the manager. The payoff was pathetic, a small haul, wildly out of proportion to the risk, and by the next day, police had them in custody. Dillinger denied everything at first, insisting they had the wrong man. The prosecutor told Dillinger's father a confession might earn leniency. His father believed that promise and advised Dillinger to plead guilty and skip hiring a lawyer. The court did not go easy. Dillinger was convicted of armed robbery and related charges and hit with a sentence of 10 to 20 years. Singleton, older and more experienced, had attorneys and ended up with a lighter sentence. Dillinger took that as betrayal by the system. He burned with resentment, the kind that doesn't cool down, it hardens, and he reportedly swore that when he got out, he'd become the most dangerous man anyone had ever seen.
He was sent to an Indiana prison to serve the time. Inside, he tried to escape more than once. Both attempts failed, and the punishment was more time. After that, he worked in the prison shirt factory. He was efficient, turning out work at a pace that made other inmates look slow. Dillinger hoped perfect behavior would buy him an early release. Sometimes he even helped other inmates finish their quotas, quietly buying loyalty. In the process, he built relationships that would later shape his entire criminal life. He wrote letters to his wife, promising change and begging for a second chance, but the letters didn't save the marriage. While he was locked up, she filed for divorce. That loss hit hard, and whatever normal life he still pictured started to collapse. His hopes for early release were denied. He requested a transfer to a higher security state prison, a move that seemed backward to the guards. He claimed it was because the prison had a better baseball team.
But the real reason was simpler. That's where the men he trusted were, and eventually the transfer was approved. Just months later, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression truly took hold. Behind prison walls, men heard rumors, but not the full scale of what was happening outside. In that new prison, Dillinger mixed with tougher, smarter criminals. He learned techniques, habits, and tricks that turned him from a reckless kid into a man who could plan. And he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. When he got out, crime would be his profession. During his sentence, through another inmate, Dillinger began corresponding with the inmate's sister. She lived in Dayton, and their messages carried the fantasy of a fresh start after release. Years passed. Dillinger's father gathered community signatures and petitions, pushing hard for his son's freedom. After nearly 9 years behind bars, Dillinger was released on parole in 1933. He walked out at 30 years old, and almost immediately he stepped into bank robbery. He briefly ran with a local crew, but he wasn't impressed. He saw weak gun handling, sloppy driving, and mistakes that would get everyone killed or locked up. So he broke away and started building his own operation. Then, on June 10, 1933, in New Carlisle, Ohio, he and his men struck a bank as employees were opening up. They had waited for hours, timing the moment like a drill. They took control fast, forced access to cash, and got out with about $10,600. On their escape, they used tricks to slow pursuit. At times, the gang even dumped roofing nails to deter pursuers. The job was a success, and it fueled his appetite. Over the next weeks, he planned more hits. Within 2 months, he and his crew robbed multiple banks across Indiana, taking sums that now felt real. He developed a signature style: fast entry, tight control, and total intimidation without wasting time. With each success, more men wanted in, and the gang grew. Then he'd move in on people, close enough to control the room and take whatever cash they had. One hit rolled into the next, and more men wanted a piece of the action. Dillinger kept tinkering, always chasing better tools and cleaner methods. Those tricks became the difference between disappearing and getting caught. But not every job went the way he wanted. About 2 months later, Dillinger and his crew went back into Ohio, setting their sights on a bank in Bluffton. What they didn't account for was one crucial detail. The bank had newer security, a time lock safe that wouldn't open on demand. If they couldn't get the safe open quickly, the delay would give the alarm and responders time to close in. On the day of the robbery, Dillinger and his men leaned hard on the staff to open the vault. The employees stalled on purpose, trying to run out the clock. When the time window closed, the sirens erupted and flooded the building with noise. The crew didn't dare stay. They got out with only about $2,100 and bolted. From June through August 1933, Dillinger's gang was hitting targets almost every 2 weeks. A big reason was money. Money to help friends still behind bars, friends they wanted back on the street. Dillinger even tried to smuggle weapons into prison for them. The robberies kept coming, and law enforcement pushed into a faster, more coordinated hunt. They were usually a step behind, but the trail started to form. Car descriptions, handwriting, small habits that kept repeating.
Eventually, police put a name to the pattern: John Dillinger. They learned he was in steady contact with a woman in Dayton. After tracking that connection, police closed in, and Dillinger was arrested in Dayton and sent to the Allen County Jail in Lima. On him, investigators found paperwork that looked like the outline of an escape plan. Dillinger refused to explain any of it. But the plan didn't stay on paper for long. 4 days after his arrest, 10 men escaped from the Indiana State Prison using guns smuggled in with Dillinger's help. Once they were free, they learned Dillinger had been captured, and they started plotting a rescue. 2 weeks later, 3 of the escaped prisoners and a parolee showed up at the Lima jail, posing as officers and claiming they were there to transport Dillinger back to prison. The sheriff followed procedure and asked for proper identification. That's when it turned violent. The sheriff was shot and later died, and Dillinger was sprung. The group made it back into Indiana and vanished again. During the rescue, they assaulted an officer, and the whole case blew up into something even bigger. Indiana authorities asked the Bureau of Investigation for help tracking Dillinger and his men. At the time, that bureau was the forerunner of today's FBI under the U.S. Department of Justice. Back then, it focused on federal investigations and support work for local agencies. It didn't yet have the broad powers people associate with the FBI today. Agents weren't routinely authorized the way they would be after later reforms. After the jailbreak, Dillinger reorganized fast and formed what became known as the Dillinger Gang. Several key members were men he'd met in prison. They immediately started planning the next wave of crimes. They gathered equipment through illegal channels, building a kit for bigger, bolder jobs. When they were ready, they struck again. They hit the Central National Bank in Greencastle and walked out with about $75,000.
To lower the heat, the gang shifted their base to Chicago, Illinois. At the time, Chicago was a magnet for organized crime and a marketplace for stolen goods. The gang figured Chicago would let them sell bonds, move money, and spend big without standing out. They also hoped to plug into larger criminal networks. Dillinger burned through cash as fast as he stole it. Around then, he met Billy Frechette at a nightclub, and the relationship turned intense quickly. But the gang's lifestyle needed constant fuel, so Dillinger went back to work. About a month later, they robbed the American Bank and Trust Company in Racine, Wisconsin, and took roughly $27,000 in cash and bonds. During the holdup, a bank employee managed to trigger the alarm. Police arrived fast. There was a brief shootout, but the gang still escaped. As they fled, they took hostages, bank staff, and even an officer, using them as moving shields. Later, those hostages were released along the route. Once again, the gang got away. The reports multiplied, and the stories started to grow in the telling. One popular tale claimed a farmer was making a deposit when the robbers stormed in. Dillinger supposedly asked, "Is that your money?" The man said yes, and Dillinger allegedly waved him off. "Take it back, we only want the bank's money." Whether true or not, stories like that made the legend bigger. To the public, Dillinger started to look like a bank-only outlaw who left ordinary people alone. And in the Great Depression, that image mattered. Unemployment was crushing, and people couldn't keep up with their loans. Banks foreclosed, seized homes, and auctioned off what families had left. Resentment toward banks ran deep. So when Dillinger robbed them, some people treated it like payback, not crime. But the next year pushed him into a different category entirely. Public opinion didn't just split, it hardened. In January 1934, the Dillinger gang robbed about $20,000 from a bank in East Chicago, Indiana. Like before, an alarm was tripped and officers rushed in. A gunfight broke out. One police officer was killed. That killing shattered the last bit of folk hero shine people had been projecting onto him. And while the headlines back in Indiana were still screaming, several of Dillinger's people, Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and others in that Tucson circle, were living loud and careless in Tucson, Arizona. They were staying at the Hotel Congress and using a rented house nearby for their luggage and gear. They had money. They had the kind of comfort that didn't match the era, not during the Depression, not in a dusty town where most people were counting pennies.
Then, days later, in late January 1934, the break that always seems impossible showed up in the form of pure bad luck: a fire. When firefighters rushed in, the men begged for help getting their heavy luggage out, bags that felt like they were packed with metal, not clothes, cash, ammunition, hardware. When the fire was out, the men pressed a thank you into a firefighter's hand, about $10 to $12. In that economy, that wasn't a tip, it was a siren. The next day, those same firefighters saw the faces again in a crime magazine and froze. The men staring back at them weren't just some guys from the hotel. They were wanted names tied to John Dillinger. The firefighters called police immediately. In a town like Tucson, you can't hide flashy spending and big confidence for long. Police moved fast, shadowing the men, watching who came and went. And then the real jackpot. The trail didn't stop at the first arrests. It led straight to Dillinger himself in the same Tucson orbit. On January 25, 1934, law enforcement closed the net. Dillinger and several gang members were arrested in Tucson. The haul was ugly and undeniable. Submachine guns, rifles, stacks of ammunition, and a thick wad of cash that investigators linked to recent robberies. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just suggest crime, it practically introduced itself. Once he was in custody, states started lining up like creditors. Indiana wanted him, Ohio wanted him, Wisconsin wanted him. Each had their own reason, their own charges, their own hunger to be the one to put the outlaw in a courtroom. Dillinger, calculating as ever, tried to steer where he'd be held and tried to delay or fight extradition because he understood that surviving the system sometimes came down to geography. Indiana prosecutors weren't about to let him angle for a safer landing spot. With a dead officer tied to the East Chicago bank robbery, Indiana had leverage. They fought to bring him back, and in the end, Indiana got him. He was transported to Crown Point Jail, advertised as escape-proof, a place built with thick steel bars, heavy doors, and the kind of layered security meant to crush hope. The state staged the moment like a trophy presentation. Cameras flashed, reporters pushed forward. Everyone wanted a clean look at the man who had become America's most wanted headline. And in the center of that circus, Lake County prosecutor Robert Estill agreed to a photo op with Sheriff Lillian Hawley right there beside him.
In the picture, Dillinger stands there like he owns the room, linking arms with the prosecutor as if they're old friends. Dillinger's hand is raised, fingers posed in a way that reads like a joke to the casual eye, but to a lot of people, it read like a dare. People would later argue he was signaling the outside, calling for help, or just enjoying the humiliation of the people trying to break him. Either way, the photo detonated public outrage. It made the state look naive, and it helped cement Dillinger's image as someone who could turn even handcuffs into propaganda. Inside Crown Point, Dillinger did what he always did. He studied. He watched routines. He measured the space between confidence and complacency. Then, one morning, he made the escape-proof label collapse like wet cardboard. No smuggled weapons, no outside rescue, just nerve and timing. And the simplest trick of all, a fake gun. At least that's the version that stuck. He carved a wooden pistol, shaped it, darkened it, polished it until it could pass at a glance. Then he used it the way real weapons are used in situations like that, not to fire, but to dominate a moment. He bluffed guards, locked men into cells, took control of the keys in the hallway, and walked out like he belonged there. Before anyone could fully process what had happened, he stole the sheriff's car and drove north toward Chicago. And that one choice, stealing a car and taking it across state lines, did more than keep him mobile. It turned him into a federal problem. Under the Dyer Act, transporting a stolen vehicle across state boundaries was a serious offense. Suddenly, the case wasn't just Indiana's or Ohio's or Wisconsin's, it was national. The Bureau of Investigation had its doorway. It could justify a full-scale hunt, and the chase for Dillinger began to reshape American law enforcement in real time. Back in the wake of the escape, the rest of the crew began to splinter under pressure. Some were captured, some were sentenced, some were killed.
Dillinger, meanwhile, returned to Chicago and rebuilt again, pulling in harder men, more volatile men, people who didn't just want money, they wanted the thrill of war against the state. Names like Babyface Nelson started circling the story. So did other criminals with reputations for recklessness and violence. This wasn't the earlier version of Dillinger's crew, the one that still tried to act like they had rules. This was a second act, sharper and more dangerous. But the more famous he became, the smaller his world got. Every bank lobby, every hotel desk, every apartment building had eyes. One mistake from a girlfriend, one landlord who paid attention, one bartender who recognized the posture. Anything could end him. And that pressure started forcing more desperate decisions. Safer hideouts, more false identities, more paranoia, more control. The legend wasn't just building, it was tightening like a noose. Fame didn't just make Dillinger notorious, it made him easy to spot anywhere he went. By early 1934, he understood that every newspaper headline was tightening the net around him. Chicago wasn't a safe haven, it was a city full of cops, informants, and people eager to cash in on a reward. So the gang slipped out of the city and looked for someplace quiet, someplace remote. They chose a secluded lodge in Wisconsin, Little Bohemia, in Mattatawish waters, surrounded by trees and water, far from big city patrols. And for a brief moment, it felt like they'd found a place where the noise couldn't reach them. But the quiet didn't last. A tip reached federal agents and a raid was set in motion. The plan was to hit the lodge at night and take the entire gang in one sweep, but instead, confusion exploded the moment the agents arrived. In the darkness, agents mistook departing diners for gang members and opened fire. Panic spread, and the whole place erupted. And that chaos gave Dillinger exactly what he needed: seconds. He and his men slipped out through the back and the rear windows, then sprinted toward the tree line, scattering along the lakeshore and vanishing into the woods. Dillinger escaped again, but the raid changed everything. He realized he was too recognizable to keep moving the way he used to. His face had become a wanted poster that could walk. So he made a desperate decision. He would try to change his appearance. He went into hiding and arranged cosmetic work to blur the features people remembered. And when that wasn't enough, he pushed further, using acid in an attempt to damage his fingerprints to make identification harder. It was a gamble built on one idea. If he could erase the evidence of who he was, he could outrun the hunt. But the hunt wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating. On June 6, 1934, the U.S. Department of Justice labeled him Public Enemy Number 1. A massive reward was announced, and tips began flooding in from across the country, turning every stranger into a potential snitch and every routine into a risk. Even with the pressure closing in, Dillinger didn't stop. He struck again, pulling off another robbery that only intensified the manhunt. But now every job brought more heat than money, and he started talking like a man cornered, obsessed with one final score big enough to disappear for good.
Around this time, he grew close to a new woman in Chicago's nightlife scene, and she shared a home with Anna Sage, a woman facing deportation and running out of time. Facing deportation, Anna Sage chose leverage over loyalty. She went to federal agents and offered cooperation, hoping the government would help her avoid being sent away. The arrangement was simple. She would put Dillinger in a predictable place at a predictable time, and she would make herself easy to identify so the agents wouldn't lose the target in a crowd. The chosen location was the Biograph Theater in Chicago, and on the night of the plan, agents took positions around the entrance and waited. When Dillinger arrived, he blended into the crowd like any other man out for a show. But the signal went up, and the agents knew they had him. When the movie ended and the doors opened, Dillinger stepped out into the night, sensed danger immediately, and moved fast, cutting toward the alley to escape the street. Agents closed in from multiple directions. The pursuit began. Shots rang out in the darkness, sharp and final, and Dillinger collapsed just outside the theater near the alley entrance, and the chase ended where it had always been heading. News of his death spread instantly.
Crowds gathered just to see proof that the legend was gone, and his body became a spectacle, the final chapter of a story Americans had been watching like a serial. Dillinger was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, his hometown's most famous resting place, but even after burial, the myth refused to die, with visitors treating his grave like a destination instead of a warning. Even in death, Dillinger couldn't stay out of the public's grasp. His headstone had to be replaced more than once because people kept chipping off pieces and taking them home like souvenirs. It was a grim kind of fandom, part curiosity, part obsession, and a warning sign of what the country had turned him into. After Dillinger fell, the rest of his crew didn't last long. One by one, they were tracked down, arrested, or killed in confrontations with law enforcement. The Dillinger gang didn't go out in a blaze of glory. It collapsed in slow motion under relentless pressure. The legend, though, survived the gang itself. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists kept circling the story because it had everything America can't resist: money, panic, escape, betrayal, and a violent ending. Decades later, Hollywood would turn that era into a polished nightmare. The best-known example is the 2009 film Public Enemies, starring Johnny Depp as Dillinger. But the real impact of the manhunt wasn't on movie screens, it was inside the federal government. The campaign to bring down Dillinger and the other so-called public enemies became a turning point for federal law enforcement. In the public imagination, the Bureau of Investigation stopped looking like a quiet office in Washington and started looking like a national force. And with that attention came authority. The federal government expanded the Bureau's reach, giving agents powers they hadn't had before, carrying weapons, making arrests, and pursuing criminals across state lines. It wasn't just a policy change, it was a transformation. The old limitations had made the Bureau dependent on local departments at the exact moments that mattered most. The Dillinger era exposed that weakness in public, in headlines, in funerals, and in the humiliations of near misses. So the rules changed, and the Bureau changed with them. In 1935, it was formally renamed the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By then, Dillinger was gone, but the institution built to catch men like him was stronger than ever. That's the irony of his story. He spent his life outrunning the law, and in the process helped push the law into a new era. To some people during the Depression, he looked like a folk hero, someone who robbed the banks that ruined their lives. To the families of the dead, and to the officers who faced his gun, he was never anything but a violent criminal. And both images, the myth and the reality, have lived side by side ever since. Dillinger's escapes made him famous. His robberies made him feared, and his ending, cornered in Chicago, gunned down outside the Biograph near the alley entrance, made him permanent. Not permanent as a man, but permanent as a symbol of a country under strain. The Great Depression didn't just break banks and businesses, it warped the public's relationship with crime and punishment. It made people hungry for villains and hungry for heroes, and sometimes unable to tell the difference. Dillinger stepped into that storm at exactly the right time, and it carried his name farther than his bullets ever could. In the end, the chase wasn't only about one outlaw. It was about what kind of country America wanted to be when everything else was falling apart. That's why this story still gets retold. Not because he deserved admiration, but because the era that created him still feels uncomfortably familiar. A desperate public, a system under pressure, and one man who believed speed, nerve, and violence could turn him into something untouchable. For a while, it worked, until it didn't. And when it finally ended, it didn't just end a gang, it marked the moment federal law enforcement stepped onto the national stage for good. That's the story of John Dillinger, public enemy number one, dead in the street, alive in the culture. And that's where we'll end today's episode. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.